This happened about 5 years ago when I was working the night shift at a 24-hour diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. And I actually liked the quiet that came with the late hours. My coworkers were a mixed bag, but most of them were decent, except for Kyle. Kyle was odd. He'd been working at the diner longer than anyone, and he made sure everyone knew it. He was in his mid-30s, tall and lanky, with greasy black hair that always hung in his face. He barely spoke unless it was to complain about the customers or criticize how someone was doing their job. There was something about him that put me on edge, but I couldn't quite figure out what. At first, I just tried to avoid him. Our shifts overlapped a few times a week, and he'd usually spend his breaks chain-smoking out back or staring at his phone in the corner booth. But as time went on, I started noticing things that made me seriously uncomfortable. For one, Kyle had a habit of showing up on nights he wasn't scheduled to work. He'd wander in around midnight, sit at the counter, and watch everyone like a hawk. When I asked him why he was there, he'd shrug and say he was just checking in. It felt like an excuse, but I didn't press it. Then there were his stories. Kyle liked to talk about his past, his adventures, as he called them. At first, they seemed harmless enough, just tales about his old jobs or places he'd traveled. But the more he talked, the darker the stories got. He'd casually mention getting into fights, following people who crossed him, and even breaking into someone's house to teach them a lesson. Most of us brushed it off as him trying to sound tough, but one story stuck with me. He told me about a former coworker who had accused him of stealing tips. She thought she could mess with me, he said, his voice low. So I followed her home one night, just to scare her, you know? Make her think twice. I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. But the way he smiled, this slow, unsettling grin, made my stomach turn. He never said what happened after that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just trying to scare her. One night, I was working alone when Kyle showed up. It was around 1 a.m., and the diner was dead. Just me and a couple of regulars nursing their coffee. Kyle walked in, sat at the counter, and ordered a coffee. I asked him why he wasn't at home, and he just shrugged, staring at me with that same unnerving smile. I went back to cleaning the tables, trying to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. When I glanced his way, he didn't even look away, just kept watching me, like he was trying to figure something out. After about an hour, the regulars left, and it was just me and Kyle. I was wiping down the counter when he finally spoke. You know, he said, his voice quiet, I don't think people realize how easy it is to disappear. I froze, the rag in my hand hovering over the counter. What? Think about it, he continued, leaning forward. All it takes is the right moment. Someone walking home alone, a car breaking down on a deserted road. 1 second they're there and the next, gone. I forced a laugh, trying to brush it off. Okay, Kyle, you're creeping me out. He grinned again, that slow, deliberate grin, just making conversation. I couldn't get through the rest of the shift fast enough. When the morning cook showed up, I practically ran out of there, my heart racing the entire drive home. Things got worse after that. Kyle started showing up every night I worked, whether he was scheduled or not. He'd sit at the counter, watching me, making little comments that felt like veiled threats. You're here all alone a lot, he'd say. Doesn't that bother you? I told my manager about it, but she just shrugged it off. That's just Kyle, she said. He's weird, but he's harmless. I wasn't so sure. The breaking point came a few weeks later. I was closing up the diner around 3 a.m. when I heard a noise out back near the dumpster. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out, thinking it was just a raccoon or something. But when I opened the back door, Kyle was standing there smoking a cigarette. "Jesus, Kyle," I said, my voice shaking. "What are you doing back here?" He didn't answer right away, just took a drag on his cigarette and stared at me. Then he said, "You should be more careful. You never know who's out here." That was it for me. I went straight to the manager the next day and told her I couldn't work with him anymore. She finally agreed to cut his hours, and a couple of weeks later, he stopped showing up altogether. I heard he got fired for threatening another employee, but I never found out the details. I still think about Kyle sometimes, especially when I'm working late or walking to my car alone. I don't know if he was just trying to scare me or if he really meant the things he said. Either way, I'm just glad I never had to find out. This happened about 3 years ago when I was working at a warehouse. The job itself was straightforward, loading and unloading trucks, keeping inventory organized. But the environment wasn't exactly friendly. It was the kind of place where everyone kept their heads down and did their work, and most people didn't bother with small talk. Except for one guy, Sean. Sean was about my age, mid-20s, but he came across as a little off. He was one of those people who could go from overly friendly to unnervingly intense in a second. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. He'd crack dumb jokes during shifts or make weird comments about the bosses, but I figured he was just trying to lighten the mood. Then he started focusing on me. At first, it was small stuff, asking where I was from, how I liked the job, that kind of thing. I'd answer politely, but he always pushed for more. "What do you do outside of work? You got a girlfriend? Where do you usually hang out?" He was nosy in a way that didn't feel casual, and it started to put me on edge. One day during our break, Sean plopped down at my table in the break room. "Hey man," he said, grinning like we were old buddies. "You hitting the bar after work?" No, I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Probably just heading home." He nodded, leaning in a little closer. "You live around here?" I gave him a vague answer, something about being in the next town over, but his questions kept coming. "You live alone?" he asked, his grin widening. "Why do you want to know?" I shot back, trying to keep it light but firm. He shrugged. "Just making conversation." That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next few weeks, Sean started getting bolder. He'd show up next to me while I was working and comment on random things he'd noticed about me. "You like black coffee, huh? I saw you grab some from the vending machine. You've got that gray hoodie you wear a lot. Must be your favorite, huh?" At first it seemed harmless, but then it hit me. He wasn't just noticing these things at work. He was watching me. It escalated one night when I stopped by a gas station after my shift. As I was filling up my tank, I noticed a car parked a few pumps away. Sean was in the driver's seat, staring at me. When our eyes met, he smiled and gave me a little wave, like this was completely normal. The next day, I confronted him. "Hey man, were you at the gas station last night?" Sean didn't even flinch. "Yeah, I was just grabbing a snack. Small world, huh?" I didn't buy it, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I let it go. Looking back, I should have said something to management right then, but I didn't. I figured he'd get bored and move on. I was wrong. A couple of weeks later, I noticed Sean hanging around in the parking lot after work. He wasn't getting into his car or talking to anyone. just standing there, watching as people left. When I walked to my car, he followed me. "You heading home?" he asked casually, falling into step beside me. "Yeah," I said, not looking at him. "Long day." He chuckled. "You've got a nice car. Bet it's reliable." I stopped and turned to face him. "Sean, what's your deal, man? Why are you always asking me weird questions?" His grin faltered for a second, but then it came back, more forced this time. "Just being friendly." "Well, it's not friendly. It's creepy. Back off." I got into my car and drove off, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. I thought I'd made it clear, but apparently Sean didn't take the hint. That weekend, I went to a local bar with some friends. Around midnight, I stepped outside to grab some air, and there he was. Sean, leaning against the wall, a drink in his hand. "Hey, man," he called out like we just bumped into each other by chance. "Didn't know you came here." "Sean, what the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my voice rising. "Relax," he said, holding up his hands. "It's a free country." I was done playing games. "You've been following me. I don't know what your problem is, but you need to leave me alone." That's when his smile disappeared. He stepped closer, his tone turning cold. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because you're the quiet guy who keeps to himself?" Before I could respond, he shoved me. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to set me off. I shoved him back, and suddenly, we were in a full-blown fight. He swung at me, but I dodged, and we ended up wrestling on the ground. People from inside the bar ran out to break it up, and someone called the cops. When the police arrived, I told them everything. How Sean had been following me, showing up places he shouldn't have been and making me uncomfortable at work. Sean denied it all, of course, but the cops found a notebook in his car with my name and random details about me written inside. Stuff like where I lived, what time I usually left work, even the names of some of my friends. Sean was arrested for harassment and stalking, and I filed a restraining order against him. He never came back to the warehouse, and as far as I know, he left town not long after that. Even now, the thought of him gives me chills. It's one thing to deal with a creepy coworker, but when it spills into your personal life, it becomes a nightmare. I'm just glad I stood up to him before it got any worse. A few years ago, I landed a job at a small marketing firm. The pay was decent, and the people seemed friendly enough, at least at first. There was one guy, though, who immediately gave me weird vibes. Greg. He was in his late 40s, a little socially awkward, and always seemed to be lurking just on the edge of conversations. Everyone in the office called him quirky, but I couldn't put my finger on why he unsettled me so much. Greg worked in IT, which meant he had access to pretty much everyone's computer. He'd come by people's desks to check on things without being asked, always giving off this weird, nosy vibe. He'd linger a little too long, ask personal questions, and sometimes make strange comments about things he shouldn't have known. For the first few weeks, I didn't interact with him much. But then my computer started acting up. I submitted a help ticket, and Greg showed up at my desk within minutes. "Let me take a look," he said, grinning in a way that made me uneasy. He crouched next to me, typing away on my keyboard while I stood awkwardly behind him. "So," he said casually, "you're new in town, right? Must be tough, starting fresh." Yeah," I said, wondering how he knew that. I hadn't told anyone at work I'd just moved. Over the next few weeks, Greg seemed to take a sudden interest in me. He'd show up at my desk for no reason, comment on things he shouldn't have known, like the fact that I lived alone or that I'd been at a particular coffee shop over the weekend. At first, I thought maybe he'd seen me around town. but the details he mentioned were too specific. It started to creep me out. One day I stayed late at the office to catch up on a project. The building was mostly empty, and the quiet was almost comforting, until I realized I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps down the hall, slow and deliberate. I figured it was the cleaning crew. But when I glanced up, I saw Greg standing in the doorway. "Working late?" he asked, his tone casual, but his presence felt anything but. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just finishing up." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked into the room and sat down at the desk across from mine, watching me. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my screen, but it was impossible not to feel his eyes on me. "You should be careful," he said after a long silence. "This building gets pretty empty at night." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. After a few minutes, he got up and left without another word, but the encounter left me rattled. Things escalated after that. One day I came back from lunch to find a sticky note on my desk that said, "Nice dress." It wasn't signed, but I knew it was from Greg. I'd seen him staring at me earlier that morning. Another time, I caught him going through the drawers in my desk. When I confronted him, he mumbled something about fixing a loose cable and walked away. The breaking point came when I noticed things missing from my desk. Small, personal items like a pen I always used, a keychain, even a photo of my dog. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful. But then one of my coworkers, Lisa, pulled me aside. "Hey," she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Has Greg been acting weird around you?" I nodded, relieved that someone else had noticed. "Yeah, why?" Lisa hesitated, then said, "A few months ago, I caught him taking a photo of my desktop with his phone. He said he was testing something, but it didn't feel right. You should be careful." That night, I decided to do some digging. I stayed late, waiting until the office was empty, and logged into the shared server that Greg managed. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but it didn't take long to find it. Buried in a folder labeled Backup Files was a collection of photos, dozens of them. Pictures of people's desks, personal items, even candid shots of coworkers taken without their knowledge. My stomach turned when I found a folder with my name on it. Inside were photos of my desk, my laptop screen, and even me, sitting at my desk, unaware. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to HR the next morning. Greg was fired within a week, but the experience stayed with me. To this day, I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings at work, always watching for anyone who seems a little too interested in other people's lives. It's one thing to be quirky. It's another to invade someone's privacy in the most unsettling way. About 6 years ago, I got a job as a receptionist at a small but busy law firm. It was a decent gig, good pay, nice coworkers, and a steady stream of clients to keep me busy. Everyone in the office was polite and professional, except for one guy, Mark. Mark was one of the junior attorneys, probably in his early 30s. At first, he seemed friendly, always stopping by my desk to chat, asking how my day was going. That kind of thing. I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just being nice. But as the weeks went on, his behavior started to feel off. It started small. Mark would linger at my desk longer than necessary, leaning in a little too close when he talked. He'd compliment me on things like my outfit or my hair, which was fine at first. But then he started making comments that crossed the line. "You have such beautiful eyes," he'd say. Or, "You look amazing in that dress." It made me uncomfortable. But I didn't know how to tell him to back off without making it awkward. Then came the gifts. One morning, I found a small box on my desk. Inside was a necklace with a little heart-shaped pendant. There was no note, but I knew it was from Mark. He'd been the only one in the office to mention my birthday the week before. I didn't wear it, and when he asked about it later, I just mumbled something about leaving it at home. The gifts kept coming. Flowers, chocolates, even a book he'd overheard me mention in passing. Each time I'd thank him politely and try to make it clear that I wasn't interested, but he didn't seem to get the hint. In fact, it only seemed to encourage him. One day, I came back from lunch to find Mark sitting at my desk, flipping through my planner. "Oh, hey," he said casually when I walked in. "Just waiting for you to get back. You've got a busy week ahead, huh?" I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't given him permission to look at my planner. It was full of personal notes, appointments, even my home address. I asked him to leave, and he laughed it off, saying he was just curious. That was the moment I realized his behavior wasn't just annoying. It was invasive. Things escalated from there. Mark started showing up at places outside of work. I'd run into him at the grocery store, at the coffee shop near my apartment, even at the gym. Each time he'd act surprised, like it was just a coincidence. "Small world, huh?" he'd say, grinning. It wasn't a small world. He was following me. I confided in one of my coworkers, Sarah, who immediately told me to go to HR. "This isn't normal," she said. "You need to report him before it gets worse." I hesitated. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it or risk causing tension in the office. But when I found a note on my car windshield one evening that said, "You looked beautiful today," I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. HR took my complaint seriously. They called Mark in for a meeting and warned him to keep his interactions with me strictly professional. For a while, it seemed to work. He stopped lingering at my desk, stopped leaving me gifts, and avoided making eye contact altogether. I thought it was over. Then one night, I came home to find my front door unlocked. My heart sank as I stepped inside, every nerve on edge. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt wrong, like someone had been there. I checked all the rooms, my hands shaking, but everything looked untouched. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I mentioned it to Sarah, who immediately urged me to call the police. They didn't find any signs of forced entry, but the experience left me rattled. I started double-checking my locks, installing extra security measures, and avoiding being alone in the office. A few weeks later, Mark resigned. HR wouldn't give me details, but I overheard someone say he'd been caught accessing employees' personal files without permission. I couldn't prove he was behind the incident at my apartment, but the timing was enough to make me suspicious. Even now, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's still out there. It's terrifying to think how far someone can take an obsession and how long it can go unnoticed. A couple of years ago, I worked at a distribution warehouse. It was one of those jobs that was physically demanding but mind-numbing. Most of the time, I kept to myself and did my work, which was fine by me. The less drama, the better. But there was one coworker, Dave, who made it impossible to ignore him. Dave had been at the warehouse for years, and everyone knew he was a little off. He was in his late 40s, scruffy, with a permanent scowl and a tendency to mutter under his breath. Most people avoided him, and he seemed to prefer it that way. I wasn't looking to make friends, so I stayed out of his way. But eventually, he decided I was worth paying attention to. It started with little things. He'd walk by my station and make comments like, "You think you're too good for us?" Or, "You'll never last here." I tried to brush it off, thinking he was just being a jerk, but it got worse. One day I caught him staring at me from across the warehouse, his expression unreadable. When I looked back, He didn't even bother to look away, just kept staring until I finally turned back to my work. The breaking point came when I stayed late one night to finish a project. The warehouse was mostly empty, just me and a couple of other guys working overtime. Around 11 p.m., I went to grab something from the supply room. The place was poorly lit, with long, shadowy aisles that always gave me the creeps. As I was grabbing what I needed, I heard the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and echoing down the aisle behind me. I turned around, expecting to see one of the other guys, but the aisle was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. No response. I shrugged it off and started walking back to my station, but the footsteps started again, this time faster, like someone was following me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the aisle was still empty. I hurried back to my station, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. That's when I saw Dave. He was standing a few feet away, leaning against a stack of pallets, just watching me. His face was partially hidden by the shadows, but I could see the faint glint of his eyes. "You lost or something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond, just stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked away without a word. I told my supervisor about it the next day, but he brushed it off. "That's just Dave," he said. "He's harmless." I wasn't so sure. Over the next few weeks, things got even weirder. I started noticing that things at my station were being moved when I wasn't there. Tools would go missing, and my water bottle once turned up in the trash can across the warehouse. I was sure Dave was messing with me, but I didn't have any proof. Then one night, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was leaving the warehouse after a late shift when I noticed a small notebook lying on the ground near the parking lot. It looked old and battered, and curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up and flipped it open. The first few pages were full of scribbles, random notes, numbers, and symbols that didn't make much sense. But as I kept flipping, I found something more disturbing. Names. Dozens of names, written in messy, slanted handwriting. Some had notes next to them. Fired, quit, moved. My stomach dropped when I saw my own name near the bottom of the list, with a note next to it that said, "New guy thinks he's smart." I brought the notebook to my supervisor the next day, but he barely glanced at it. "Dave's always been a little strange," he said. "Don't read too much into it." I couldn't believe how dismissive he was, but I didn't push it. Instead, I started looking for another job. Something about that notebook and the way Dave watched me made me feel like I wasn't safe there. My last week at the warehouse, I stayed late one final time to help out a friend. As I was clocking out, I saw Dave standing near the back door, watching me again. This time, he spoke. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Got places to be?" He smiled, a slow, unsettling grin. "Good. You don't belong here anyway." I didn't respond. Just walked to my car as quickly as I could and got out of there. That was the last time I saw Dave, and honestly, I hope I never see him again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. Would I have just been another name in his notebook with "gone" written next to it? I'll never know. But one thing's for sure. I've never looked at coworkers the same way since.